They rose out of the cold North Atlantic with white flags fluttering from their periscopes and conning towers, a flotilla of steel leviathans that had prowled through war, now obliged to surface and surrender. In May 1945, following Karl Dönitz's order to cease hostilities and surface, more than 100 German submarines limped into Allied hands. They did not simply vanish. They were collected, counted, catalogued, tested, sunk, repurposed, and in a few rare cases preserved. The question at the heart of this story is simple. What happened to the German U-boats that didn't disappear at the end of the war? The immediate aftermath was one of bureaucratic overwhelm and practical urgency. U-boats from every theater, North Atlantic, Arctic, Baltic, converged on Allied anchorages: Loch Arable and Loch Ryan in Scotland, Lissahalli in Northern Ireland, Portland on England's south coast, and ports elsewhere in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. Boarding parties from the Royal Navy and U.S. Navy carried out formal seizures. Crews were escorted ashore and interned. Naval intelligence and salvage teams pried into hulls, seized codebooks and charts where they existed, and tried to assess the seaworthiness and strategic value of each vessel. For the Allies, the problem was not merely triumphalist paperwork. It was a logistical headache. Hundreds of submarines, many worn out or battle-damaged, had to be stored somewhere secure while nations decided their fate. If the surrender created the problem, Operation Deadlight provided the blunt solution for most of the fleet. The Tripartite Naval Commission, representing Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, faced choices: keep the boats, distribute them among Allied navies, study some examples, or destroy the remainder. The decision to sink scores of submarines was driven by a mix of security, cost, and the realities of post-war demobilization. Maintaining and crewing hundreds of captured U-boats was expensive. Scrapping at scale would tie up yards already stretched by peacetime conversion. Holding them in harbor indefinitely invited disputes and posed a security risk. So the Allies drew a line. A large portion of surrendered boats would be disposed of by sinking. Operation Deadlight, carried out between November 1945 and February 1946, took a simple, methodical, and sometimes chaotic form. Of roughly 156 U-boats surrendered to the Western Allies, 116 were designated for destruction. Tugboats and destroyer escorts took them out beyond the continental shelf to designated dumping grounds off the northwest coast of Ireland, known in naval shorthand as areas XX, YY, and ZZ. Many of the submarines could not even be safely towed. Roughly 56 sank under tow because of weakened hulls, storms, or bad weather, leaving them to rest where the sea claimed them. Others reached the scuttling areas and were finished off by gunfire, by explosive charges set aboard, or simply by opening sea valves and letting them founder. The sight was both clinical and melancholy: lines of hulks towed under gray skies, crews of tugs and escorts watching as once lethal weapons were rendered harmless by rust and the deep. A few named vessels illustrate the texture of this deliberate destruction. Some small, late-built craft, Type 43 boats, had the speed and stealth to be valuable in a different war, but they too were often marked for deadlight. Boats such as those recorded in post-war lists were towed out and sunk. Others, already damaged or slowly filling with seawater, never reached the scattering grounds and went down at sea. These sinkings were not theatrical acts of revenge. They were a practical clearing of the slate. Casualties during these operations were limited relative to the slaughter of preceding years, but the sea still took its toll, and the silent graveyards off Ireland became the final resting place for scores of sailors' workplaces and war machines. But the narrative of disappearance has a major counterpoint. Not every U-boat was consigned to the deep. A select group was spared, studied, and redistributed. The most advanced German designs of late war, notably the Type 28 and the smaller Type 43, represented genuine technological leaps in submarine design. They featured streamlined hulls optimized for underwater speed and stability, significantly increased battery capacity that allowed longer submerged runs, and snorkel systems that permitted diesel engines to run while the submarine remained at periscope depth. Those advances promised to reshape submarine warfare. The Allies recognized that these boats were more than trophies. They were blueprints. The Tripartite Naval Commission oversaw allocations. Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union each took examples for technical examination and trials. The Soviet Navy in particular absorbed German high-endurance design ideas as it built the foundation of its post-war submarine force. Western navies, too, borrowed lessons. Hull shapes, battery layouts, and systems integration informed the development of new conventional submarines in the immediate post-war decades. The classic short answer is that the German submarine did not simply disappear. Its engineering DNA migrated into the next generation of boats. Individual cases help make that abstract transfer concrete. U-234 is one of the most extraordinary examples of a submarine that did not disappear into the sea. Intercepted en route in May 1945, U-234 arrived with a cargo that startled Allied intelligence. Technical documents, advanced weapon components, and material later identified as part of an enriched or partially processed uranium consignment intended for Japan. The boat and its cargo fell into American hands and became the subject of intense examination. Its materials and papers fed into Allied technical programs and post-war investigations, exemplifying the direct, sometimes uncomfortable link between captured German technology and the next chapter of military research. Other boats were turned over for trials or for service in Allied navies before being retired. Some U-boats were transferred to the navies of smaller post-war European states or to colonial navies, where they served briefly as stopgap patrol vessels. Vessels such as U-3017 were recommissioned for evaluation and testing under new flags, in some cases receiving temporary British designations as they helped Allied engineers to understand German systems. The Royal Canadian Navy, the French Navy, Norway, Denmark, and others made use of captured boats in various capacities, experimentation, training, or limited operational service, before those hulls were scrapped or otherwise disposed of. A second thread of the U-boat's afterlife is museumization and preservation. A handful escaped both the sinking and the scrapyard and became objects of public memory. U-505, captured in an exceptionally daring boarding action in 1944 and brought into U.S. custody, survived the war and decades afterward found new life as a museum ship at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. There, visitors can walk through tight passages and feel the claustrophobic reality of submarine life. Bunks stacked like coffins, the rhythm of cramped control rooms, and the smell of metal and oil that defined 3 decades of underwater warfare. In Germany, U-995, a Type 7C-41, was returned and preserved at Le Beau as a monument and museum, a site for reflection on both naval history and the human cost of conflict. Boats like U-534 were raised years after the war and installed in museum displays, allowing the public to confront the hulks that once prowled the Atlantic. These museum survivors perform a dual function. They preserve technical artifacts, torpedo mounts, periscopes, diesel-electric machinery, and they humanize the crews who lived and sometimes died within them. When we stand in the conning tower or peer into a control compartment, the machines stop being purely mechanical. They become stages for human stories of fear, boredom, courage, and endurance. At the same time, curators and archaeologists insist on context. These exhibits are not celebrations of wartime prowess, but tools for education and remembrance. The technology harvested from captured U-boats found its way into the Cold War. The Type WW2, in particular, altered thinking about submarine design. Its emphasis on submerged performance over surfaced operation anticipated the modern concept of the submarine as an essentially underwater craft, rather than a surface ship that submerged to hide. Soviet post-war designs absorbed German lessons and evolved into classes that would challenge NATO's control of the seas. Western designers reacted similarly. Battery technology, hydrodynamic hull forms, and the idea of rapid underwater maneuverability informed successive generations of diesel-electric submarines. In this sense, many German ideas survived the war, not as intact boats roaming the seas under the swastika, but as concepts and components incorporated into fleets built for a new and colder conflict. Not all transfers were straightforward or uniformly beneficial. The Allies learned what was worth keeping, what needed refinement, and what could be discarded. Trials with captured boats uncovered problems as well as promises. Early post-war assessments noted construction shortcuts, rushed workmanship, and systems that required more than documentation to become reliably operational. Still, the technological legacy is unmistakable. German engineering accelerated the pace of submarine innovation and forced major navies to rethink strategy and design during the early Cold War decades. Beneath the waves, however, the story of disappearance is literal. The Deadlight Graveyard off the Irish coast remained largely undisturbed for decades, until maritime archaeologists and surveyors began to map and photograph the site with modern sonar and submersibles. Between 2001 and 2003, archaeologist Innes McCartney led surveys that reconnected the public and scholarship with these underwater cemeteries. Sonar imagery and occasional manned dives revealed rows of hulks lying on seabeds of mud and sand, their metal skins eaten by corrosion, their once sharp silhouettes softened by time. McCartney's work and that of others turned previously anonymous points on a chart into identified wrecks, allowing historians to match records with remains, which boats had been lost in tow, which had been deliberately fired upon and sunk, and which had settled intact enough to tell structural stories. The condition of these wrecks varies. Some are remarkably preserved in cold, oxygen-poor mud. Others are twisted by explosive charges or broken by the forces of currents and trawling nets. For maritime archaeologists, each hull offers a lesson in construction and in the material afterlife of war. For descendants and communities, the seabed sites are also war graves and places of remembrance. Governments and local organizations have, in many cases, treated them with the respect due to sites associated with loss of life. Throughout these threads runs a human dimension that deserves careful attention. The men who surrendered those boats were not abstractions. Many were very young, many were exhausted, and a number had already lost shipmates and friends. Post-war handling ranged from efficient processing to confusion. Crews who had fought fiercely were now directed to turn over their machines, climb ashore, and adapt to a sudden end of a maritime life that had defined them. Interment and repatriation followed ad hoc timetables. Some former submariners went on to productive civilian lives. Others remained haunted by memories of the war. Museum exhibits and memorials attempt, in different registers, to acknowledge both the engineering and the experience without glamorizing the cause those boats had once served. So where does that leave the question asked at the top? What happened to the German U-boats that didn't disappear after World War II? The answer is twofold and strikingly balanced. Physically, the majority were deliberately disposed of, towed out and sunk under Operation Deadlight, lost during tow, or broken up for scrap. Their hulls sank into graveyards that for decades lay largely undisturbed, only to be rediscovered and recorded by modern archaeology. Technically and intellectually, however, they did not vanish. A smaller number of boats were spared for study, taken into Allied hands, and used to seed post-war submarine development. Elements of German design, hull forms, battery concepts, snorkel integration, migrated into both Soviet and Western navies, shaping the face of undersea warfare during the Cold War. A handful of survivors, preserved as museum ships, allow visitors to touch, smell, and understand the cramped metal world where sailors lived and fought. The U-boats that remained after 1945 therefore lived two kinds of lives. Some sank to become cold, silent monuments on the seabed. Others were disassembled and reborn as ideas in the navies and shipyards of the post-war world. A few became public artifacts that confront us with the human and technological legacies of conflict. The disappearance was only partial. The steel disappeared into the deep, but the engineering and the memory endured. If this look at the fate of surrendered U-boats sparked your curiosity, please like and subscribe. There's more deep dive history ahead. And for those who want to keep exploring, watch the suggested video on what happened to Germany's weapons and tanks after the war. It picks up the other half of the story about how wartime materiel was handled, repurposed, and remembered. In the end, the U-boat story is less a clean ending than a transformation. Machines sent to the bottom or the scrapyard, designs that seeded the next generation of submarines, and a handful of preserved hulls that ask us to remember the people who served inside them.